everybody, and welcome back to Upshift Creek. We're doing things a little bit differently this week. There's no race to talk about, there's no memes to talk about, but joining me, as always, we've got Nick Calderone. But because Ryan isn't here this week, we do have a special guest. Nick, who have you brought along?
I have brought what I think our Upshift Creek fans are going to really dig into. My buddy, Rick DeBruhl, and I'm so pleased to call this guy my buddy because he's also the voice of Barrett Jackson. And any of the fans out there watch the Barrett Jackson auction, you'll hear Rick. Rick was also a pit reporter. He did ESPN, IndyCar, Trans Am, Champ Car, NASCAR, and was a pit reporter at one point for Formula One as well. He's an Emmy-winning journalist and a two-time author, a communications expert, and storyteller. Welcome to Upshift Creek, my friend.
I don't know if I can live up to that intro. That was pretty spectacular. Jeez, it's like, have I actually done all that? Am I that old?
Well, I can see some of the Emmys over your shoulder, so I can definitely believe that intro. Welcome.
I just bought them at a garage sale.
So yeah, let's just jump right into it. Have you always been a Formula One fan, or did you sort of develop an appreciation of Formula One when you were actually there, working among them?
I'm one of those people. I actually grew up a car geek, and for no reason. I mean, my family had a Volkswagen and a Rambler growing up, so it's not the stuff that automotive love affairs are made of. But I became a car kid early on. Loved cars, loved racing. I always assumed that car people were racing people and racing people were car people. As I've gotten older, I discovered there's plenty of people who love racing and know nothing about cars. And right. I run into a lot of car people who really know nothing about racing. So I grew up in both. And, when I was a kid, racers did everything. So if you raced in the Indy 500, you raced in Formula One, you raced in sports car racing. Look at Mario Andretti. Here's a guy who won the Indy 500, won the Formula One World Championship, won the Daytona 500, won all kinds of things. Those are the kind of people I grew up with. So when I grew up, I followed Formula One, I followed IndyCar, I followed sports car racing. Didn't follow NASCAR as much just because as a kid growing up on the West Coast, NASCAR wasn't that big a thing. And so once again, all those things were kind of combined. I didn't really understand the difference between it. It wasn't until we've gotten to, years later where we begin to see the specialists, Formula One drivers who don't dare do anything other than Formula One, or IndyCar drivers who really don't do anything other than IndyCar. So I grew up a car geek. I went to college trying to figure out how to get involved in racing and accidentally got involved in broadcasting, went into TV news and tried to figure out how to get my way back into racing. And I started doing pit reporting for ESPN back in 1988. My very first race was a Portland IMSA sports car race, which was great. And then I went on to do everything from gravel Rama to Formula One, and I was the voice of Formula One in the U.S. for a couple of years for Speed. So I was the play-by-play guy. So
tell us about that, Rick. Tell us about those years as a Formula One play-by-play guy. Like, Ollie and I are aficionados. We love Formula One, but to be there and have your hands on F1, that must have just been so exciting.
Yeah, my very first Formula One race, I think, was 1990. The first Formula One race that I actually, did as a broadcaster. The first Formula One race I ever saw was the 1971 Quester Grand Prix, and most people don't even know about this race. It took place at Ontario Motor Speedway, and it was this bizarre non-points race where they had Formula One racers battling against what then were called Formula 5000 cars, which were, big block 5-liter engines, whereas Formula One were much lighter. It was billed as the Americans versus the Europeans. It was at this track called Ontario Motor Speedway, which was a replica of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, 2.5 miles around. But back then it had a road course in the middle. And it's just it used to be in Ontario, California, not far from where the NASCAR Speedway was. But it was billed as the Americans versus the Europeans. And it was a pretty amazing race. Listening to those Formula One cars, they whistle by. I can still remember the Matra V12 going through. And interestingly enough, it was won that day by Mario Andretti in a Ferrari. So it was like, well, wait a minute. It was the Americans versus the Europeans. Who won?
So everybody won.
Yeah,
okay, everyone's really confused. That's just that we were all very happy in this situation. That's great. That's kind of like the Ryder Cup of racing. They should do something like that still.
Yeah.
That would be so fun.
I agree. You know, make it a run what you brung. Have everybody come out, bring whatever car you got, modify it, have a little bit of fun. Pick some weird track that isn't going to be Formula One or isn't going to be NASCAR or isn't going to be IndyCar. Something that's going to, you know, make everybody battle a little bit. They used to have a race in here in town at Phoenix International Raceway. It's called the Copper World Classic, and it was pretty much whatever you want to bring, just bring it. You know, we had NASCAR racers versus, you know, sprint cars. It was amazing stuff out there on the track.
Ollie, we were just talking about how fun it would be to have some of the F1 veterans racing against each other. You know, bring back Vettel, bring back Raikkonen. Let's see some of these guys, you know, go duke it out in a less than serious environment.
So they did a race series like that once called Fast Masters, and they used Jaguar XJ220s.
Oh wow!
And it was a great idea, but these drivers, and this was an American series back then, beat the crap out of these cars. I mean, these were really expensive cars, and they just, because they were having so much fun, that they beat the crap out of them. So if you do it, you got to find cars that you can break and repair.
Right. Because sometimes, I mean, we see that even now, they'll do a sort of a display race. They'll go around Monaco and some of those old classic cars, you know, Niki Lauda's Ferrari and things like that.
But display, right? They're not really.
Yeah.
I know, but if you stack one of those into the wall, which I think Charles did with the Ferrari, I mean, that's like a $5, $10, $15 million car.
You know, if you have to ask the price, you can't afford it.
So Rick, tell me about what it was like in those F1 days. Give me the idea of the years that you did it, and who were the names at the time, and what did that feel like?
So once again, I started doing it in 1990. I was doing play-by-play. I was actually just filling in Bob Varsha at that point. We both worked for ESPN, and when he couldn't make a race, I was kind of his designated fill-in. Very first race I ever did was the San Marino Grand Prix, which was actually run at Imola. So that's always been one of my favorite tracks, and it was won by Riccardo Patrese. So you know, it's I wish I could say that my first race that I did was won by Senna or Prost or Mansell or somebody. It's always Riccardo Patrese. Like, people are like, who's Riccardo Patrese? But he was a great driver. He ran for Williams at the time. I've got a great model a friend of mine made for me that of that particular race, and you know, at the Tamburello curve. And you know, and then I got to be I got to fill in a number of times in Hockenheim. I used to do the Canadian Grand Prix, and so I didn't get to do a lot of them. And then when I started doing play-by-play in Formula One for speed, that was the era when we weren't going to the races, which is similar to what they do now in many ways. You know, where you just sit, you know, in a studio. So I'd go to Charlotte, North Carolina every 2 weeks, and I'd sit there with Steve Matchett and David Hobbs, and we'd call the races. And it was, you know, fun to be with, you know, David and Steve, because they're pretty amazing people. But at the same time, it's kind of disappointing when you're like, yeah, I'm doing the Monaco Grand Prix from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm doing the Brazilian Grand Prix. I can actually still remember when I got called from ESPN one year, and they said, hey, we want you to do the Brazilian Grand Prix. And I'm like, awesome. When do I leave? Well, we're doing it in Bristol, Connecticut. And I remember going, what? And that was
the glitz and glamour.
Yeah, that was the beginning of the end of the glamour age, you know. And remember, David Hobbs and I did it. We did literally in a closet in Bristol, Connecticut. This room was about this big, so it wasn't very much.
Well, actually, let's talk a little bit about that, because sort of Formula One fandom in America especially has kind of ebbs and flows. You know, I mean, there's been times back in the past, I remember there were street races in Phoenix, there was an Indianapolis race that had like 6 cars in it. It kind of bounced around, and it kind of bounced around on television as well. Then it sort of ended up at COTA, that incredible track where even Kimi Räikkönen was racing this past weekend in NASCAR. But just 5 years ago, F1 was giving away the rights to F1 for free. And now it's a multi-million dollar deal. It's really become a huge deal again here in the States. You've been a big part of it for the last couple of decades. Have you noticed that sort of same way that for a while America, like, they didn't even seem interested?
You know, it really, I wish I could say it was this. It's kind of been this, to be honest with you. You know, even when Mario Andretti was winning his championship back in 1978, I mean, you know, there weren't that many people in the United States paying that much attention to it, because you got to remember, back then you couldn't get it on television. You know, if you saw the Monaco Grand Prix on ABC Wide World of Sports, that was it. I think early on there was a lot of interest because racing in general in the 50s and 60s was much more, popular than it is today as a whole. Whereas, what's happened over the last 5 years kind of is unprecedented. The concept of drive to survive, together with everything that's been going on in the racing world, has really brought new attention to it. And so as a result, I would argue that Formula One racing is more popular today in the United States than I think it's ever been.
You feel it though, don't you? I mean, it's just even online. There's a huge community on Reddit, big Formula One community, and like Formula One even gave them permission to be able to use their footage. Then there's the Formula Dank Reddit, which we go to, we had no idea that there was comedy fans when it came to Formula One, but we get so much joy out of the joy that people are getting out of racing now. There's a great community. Do you ever get online with things like that?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I'm part of the F1 subreddit, of course, and I read plenty of stuff. When I was doing Formula One 20 years ago, I used to explain to people it's like being the Super Bowl announcer in Europe. It's a big deal, just not here. And I would sit there and I would explain Formula One to people and be like, well, imagine an Indy car, but it's a little different. And I had to use the Indy 500 analogy. Well, now when you talk about IndyCar, you have to use a Formula One analogy. Well, it's like that, only different. So that once again, yes, it's been an interesting few years for the championship, but the reality is that Drive to Survive on Netflix has totally changed the concept of what people think of as racing and brought that behind the scenes drama. And now, of course, everybody's trying to copy it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the golf one, the tennis one.
Yeah. The shackles have been released. Ever since Liberty Media came along, it seems like they wanted all of this great stuff that us fans have been interested in for years to finally push it out there. Yeah, share it, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. This is an incredible joust for speed.
And I sometimes think, boy, wouldn't it have been awesome if Drive to Survive had existed back when Nigel Mansell was there, when Alain Prost was there, and Ayrton Senna, when Ayrton Senna and Prost were on the same team, the crap out of each other, literally running each other off the track. Can you imagine a Drive to Survive in that era? That would have been amazing.
Can we get it again? Do you think that kind of thing can happen again? I mean, if it's ever going to happen, it could be now between Max and Checo. You've got these two solid drivers in great cars. I mean, or is it just too buttoned up these days?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, obviously, Drive to Survive is great these days. The difficulty becomes, you've got a generational driver in Max Verstappen. I mean, somebody who can just blow away the field. Now, you go back to 20 years ago, back when I was doing Formula One and Michael Schumacher. You always have to remember that while you build two cars that are theoretically identical, at some point, what you do is you say, you know what? We've got Max Verstappen who likes to have his car a little bit more like this. Checo likes it a little bit more like this, but we think Max is going to win just a little bit more. Yeah. I was part of a discussion with an IndyCar team just recently, and we were talking about, trying to make sure that this particular IndyCar team, kind of plays well behind the scenes. And they were saying, look, when it comes to engine mapping, whose engine mapping are they going to use? This driver or this driver's? They like this driver more. So it goes back to, you think theoretically all cars are the same, but back in the days of going back to Michael Schumacher and whether his teammate was Eddie Irvine or Rubens Barrichello, the car was designed to do what Michael Schumacher wanted the car to do, what fit his driving style. I guarantee you that Red Bull is designed around Max Verstappen's driving style, because number one, he's good. If I were a team, I'd be designing it around him. But the problem becomes, okay, how do you increase that level of competition between those two drivers? And, we got lucky this last race, I mean, a little penalty that, the engine problem associated with Max Verstappen moved him back. Leclerc had the issue, so he got moved back. And we had some interesting passing. But let's face it, had it not been for that, it probably would have been another Max Verstappen runaway.
Yeah,
for sure. I mean, what you were saying, you've been a pit reporter. You've been to some of these races. Let's talk about some of those cool moments. I've been lucky enough. I got to go to the paddock a couple of times. It's like you get given the golden ticket, and once you're back there, it's like a magical wonderland of races and everything else. Do you have any great memories of things from back then?
Yeah, so the very first one, I wasn't actually a pit reporter. I was just visiting, and it was at the 1982 Long Beach Grand Prix. So once again, I grew up in Los Angeles. And I started that first Formula One race was Equestria Grand Prix. I attended the very first Long Beach Grand Prix, which most people don't know was not a Formula One race, it was a Formula 5000 race. Attended the first Formula One race and most of the Formula One races after that. 1982, I had the good privilege of going back, and I was just doing a little bit of fun work, not real, I wasn't part of a broadcast team at that point, hadn't started that part of my life. And I had a good friend of mine named Harley Cluxton, who was a Ferrari dealer here in town. He still runs a company called Grand Touring Cars, wheels and deals with collector cars. And he invited me to come down to the pits, and Harley knew everybody. And so, he kind of takes me down, and the next thing I know, I'm standing there in part of this discussion, and it's me and Harley and Mario Andretti, who obviously won the World Championship in 1978, Formula One Championship, and Keke Rosberg, who was about to win the World Championship that year. It was just the four of us, nobody else. And we're having a discussion about Le Mans because Keke Rosberg was saying he would never race there. It was too insane. And Mario Andretti was talking about how much fun it was. And of course, I can add nothing to this conversation, right? I'm a nobody. I don't even know what I'm doing there. And I had one of those out-of-body experiences where I kind of looked around me for a moment. And for almost a fraction of a moment, I could see what it looked like from a distance. And there was this huge crowd of people surrounded, because here you had Mario Andretti, Keke Rosberg, Harley and I were nothing in this bunch. And I'm watching this and hearing this discussion about these two racers. And I'm thinking, how the heck did this happen? How did I get here? This was one of the greatest moments of my life. And once again, I wasn't working. I was just listening to the conversation. And, I mean, I can't add anything. Oh yeah, Le Mans, cool. I'd do it. I didn't say anything, but it's just those moments like that. And yeah, there's other racing moments where because I've had a really fortunate career. I've been all over the place, got to do the Indy 500 for a long time. Formula One's amazing. I was doing Formula One when Senna was there and Prost was there and Schumacher was there. But that one moment of being able to sit there and listen to those two amazing drivers talk about, a debate between Keke Rosberg and Mario Andretti about whether they'd ever drive at Le Mans.
Speaking of Andretti, Rick, speaking of Andretti, any chance, do you think they'll get back into Formula One? There's been a lot of talk with them and Cadillac and what's going to happen. Is that possible?
It's really hard to say. And the problem is that, that basically they've, a lot of people in Formula One kind of feel that Michael Andretti hasn't played the game very well. He's been trash talking Formula One behind the scenes as a result, it's like, won't let him in. And so he's just not their first choice of teams to let in. It's like, well, come on, people. I mean, it's the Andretti name. It brings America back into the fold. He's going to bring American drivers into the fold. Why would you not want to do this? And I mean, at the most basic level, they don't want to do it because any extra team is going to dilute the money that comes to the existing teams. But if you're going to expand, why not? Why would you expand with, two guys you've never heard of? Right. Expand with a name like Andretti. Absolutely. I think that if I were Formula One and I was, and once again, if I'm Liberty Media and I run the show, they're in.
It's gotta be. Exactly. With all the renewed interest here in America, how could you not, have the Andretti name in there? That's just me. I agree with you.
And bringing Cadillac along. And the argument is, well, Cadillac's not really going to bring in an engine. They're going to rebadge the engine. Are they going to actually come up and
okay, Alfa Romeo, Aston Martin, like
hello.
That's just a little bit of European bias though, isn't it? Let's be honest. It's like, and coming up on the outside, a Cadillac. Wait, this is Formula One. This is not NASCAR. We turn right and left.
And it just boils down to, it's always an insider's club. And the people, people who are inside don't want people on the outside coming in. And they'll make 100 different reasons. Oh, he's too loud. He's too brash. Cadillac isn't bringing a real engine. This idea. It's like, no, they just don't really want other people coming in.
So who's your driver? All right. So I remember because I was lucky. I got to go. My dad's ex-boss used to work for Red Bull, and we were in Singapore, and we met with his friend. He says, "Oh, my buddy Chris will be here, and he'll bring us into the track." Chris was Christian Horner. I'm like, well, okay, nice to meet you, Christian Horner. Where's we going? And I had the same experience as you. We're being shot by a BBC crew for a documentary. I go, is this really happening? I get to go, like Luke, I get to meet Vettel the year he goes on to become the championship. I snuck in my McLaren stuff so I could get Lewis Hamilton and Jenson Button's autographs while sneaking off. But we were there backstage and it was with my dad and he stopped dead in his tracks and gasped and kind of put his hand on my chest and stopped me. And I went, what's up, Dad? He goes, it's Niki Lauda. And it was just, it just burnt into my memory that Dad, with everything that was going on around us, there goes Michael Schumacher, because he was racing at Mercedes, but for Dad, he saw Niki Lauda and it was like he was, you know, a young kid again. He's like he was a young man again going, I remember watching this guy race.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I mean, I think of the drivers when I grew up. I mean, my all-time god of drivers, you know, as good as Michael Schumacher is, as good as Hamilton is, my god of drivers is Dan Gurney. I mean, obviously I'm American, but you look at what Dan Gurney was able to achieve, to win a Formula One race in a car that he designed. And I mean, people don't realize that he was supposed to be the driver for Jack Brabham in 1966. And instead, he decided he wanted to build his own car, which, you know, didn't win a race till 1967. Well, the Brabham team went on to win 2 consecutive Formula One championships. If Dan Gurney had been in that car, he likely would have won at least 1, maybe 2 championships, because that was the winning car. Now, so, I mean, he had that kind of skill. He was that good. But, you know, but beyond that, you know, I had the good fortune of knowing Dan later in his life when he was doing sports cars and IndyCar and all those kind of things. Dan is one of the greatest, nicest people you could ever meet on the planet. What a class act on every level. And I can tell you, I've been around plenty of race car drivers. Most of the race car drivers I've been around, honestly, are great. But I've been around a few jerks, people that I wouldn't cross the street for, you know. It's like, come on.
Name them. Who was it?
Who
were the jerks?
Let me think. Who could I think of? You know, well, like Ralph Schumacher. Ralph Schumacher was a putz. I mean, you know, his brother's so good, and you know, his brother was so great. We'd be in, you know, doing interviews with Michael Schumacher, and he was always great. You know, and Ralph, it was like I always got the feelings like I'd rather be any place else but here. I'm like, well, you know what? We're part of the game. I mean, you know, if you don't want to do the interviews, then don't be a part of the game. And more importantly, your brother is so good at it. Why would you not want to be? And more importantly, your brother is so much better.
Yeah, maybe that was the problem.
Yeah.
Sounds like Kimi Räikkönen, that guy, the legendary Kimi. He even like, if they've already been posting it all over Reddit, because he was at that NASCAR race the other day, and like the guy doing the grid walk came up and do you mind if I talk to you? And he goes, yes.
That's why I loved Kimi Räikkönen. I loved him just because he was such a curmudgeon on the grid. But he was great. He was fast, and
Kimi's an acquired taste, and we've kind of grown into Kimi, because in the early years, you know, once again, when you're on the TV side, you want somebody who's going to be a fun interview, who's going to bring you interesting comments, you know, who's going to say something interesting. And you'd get Kimi, and he'd be like, yeah, whatever. You know, and I gotta tell you, the best Kimi Räikkönen impersonation on the planet is Steve Matchett. You know, the guy that he used to do Formula One with, the author, and he does a spectacular Kimi Räikkönen impersonation.
Rick, I remember you being a big Mark Webber fan for that very reason. Because
Webber, Mark's a great guy. I mean, you know, back when he was running Formula One, I was a big fan of Mark Webber. He's kind of mediocre in his interviewing role these days, but yeah, I mean, he was a nice guy. And you know, I mean, I tend to root for nice guys. I also always root for the underdog. You know, I always root. You know, right now, I mean, of course, why wouldn't you not root for Alonso? I mean, here's a guy who has not won a race in 10 years, won his last championship in 2006. He's with a team that should absolutely not be, you know, running up front. They suddenly seem to have landed in this role, at least for the time being, of being the second best team. I mean, how could you not root for Fernando Alonso? Yep. I mean, look at the grin on his face every single day.
Great storyline developing in that. Now, Rick, that kind of dovetails us nicely into what we like to do on the show called the Upshift Award, meaning who or what or anything, who would you grant a trophy to, the Upshift Award. And we also do the Upshift Creek Award. Who do you think, or who would you
Oscar
grant?
Piastri's Upshift Creek.
Okay.
Yeah, his name has come up in that category a few times already. Early in
or maybe I should just put McLaren there, to be honest with you. You know, it's like the Upshift Creek. I mean, I think McLaren spent so much time creating so much drama last year, and they forgot to focus on their car. You know, I mean, now they're trying to, you know, shift the team around, do some other things. But like, you know what, at some point you need to focus on what you're doing and not about the drama off to the side. So that's the Upshift Creek. The trophy, I mean, it's easy to say Alonso. I mean, right off the bat, you know, because I mean, they brought that team, and I know people complain, oh, it's Lance Stroll and all his money, he's just buying this, that, and the other thing. I don't care. All I really want is from somebody from the back of the field to move up and add some excitement that you were not expecting.
Yeah.
The ability to have somebody who challenges up front, wins a race in the rain, whatever it may be. So Alonso's the easy choice. I'm trying to look down further in the grid and think if there's anybody else that kind of deserves a little bit more. I'm a Yuki Tsunoda fan.
I'm rooting for Yuki. I like him.
I mean, you got to think about this. He's only 22 years old.
He's only 3 feet tall.
Yeah. Amazing what you can do when you're that young and that short. But I mean, he's, when you think about it, he's like 22 years old. I think this is like his 44th or 45th Grand Prix coming up. He should just now be coming into his own. People are always criticizing him as, oh, he's not this, he's not that. He caused these accidents, all that kind of stuff. It's like, hey, he was just a kid. Yeah. I mean, he's not the youngest guy in the paddock, but he's actually pretty close. Although there's quite a few 22, 23-year-olds now. But still, I mean, I'm a big fan of Yuki. It's like, I want to see them, see what they can do. Is there anybody else that deserves?
I gave it an upshift award to Logan Sargent for not stuffing the Williams in the first 2 years. I mean, honestly,
other than in qualifying?
Yeah, well, I'll include that. But brand new to F1 in a what's not quite the worst car anymore. But and I'm excited to see what he can do as an American.
Yeah, I mean, he's got a long way to go to prove that he can be just more than an American in the series. But having said that, look at baseball, right? I mean, you can have some young phenom who comes up and they tank when they get to the major leagues. And the flip side is you can have somebody who was drafted 32nd and they come up and for whatever reason, they figure out how to understand the game. And the same thing is true in racing, right? Where you have somebody who comes up and, maybe they're good in Formula 2 or in the lower ranks and they get up to Formula 1 and get the right car at the right time and everything kind of clicks. And so, I mean, you never know. I mean, maybe, Logan will do better as time goes along. You go back to Michael Schumacher. Michael Schumacher was not considered the phenomenon he was. He just showed up and blew everybody away. It's just one of those people that suddenly arrived. And you're like, wait a minute, we didn't think you were that good in the lower series. Yeah, we thought you were good, but we didn't know this. By the way, I can remember the day. I can remember the day Michael Schumacher arrived. I'm at the Canadian Grand Prix. I'm in the pits. And it was like, Friday, we're getting ready to go for maybe one of the first practice sessions. And he had been racing. He started off racing for Jordan, then got picked up by Benetton. And suddenly after a race or two at Benetton, it was like, oh, this guy's the real deal. And Michael Schumacher, I mean, he's this young kid and he's just, bubbly and ebullient and he's kind of looking around. And he's having so much fun. And all these photographers surrounded like in the front of him, and they're taking pictures, they got all make cameras out. But there was this no man's land between Michael and the photographers. And I realized that was the beginning of that, you're so big a star that we can't even come into that no man's land around you, and yet he was still just a kid. He was still so excited to be there. But I remember looking at it. And I remember at the time thinking, ooh, this is different. Something has changed here. The photographers aren't going up and talking to him. They're just taking pictures of him. They're just standing back. And it's that moment when you realize this guy's a star.
That's very cool. Actually, that's interesting. I kind of want to ask is that, what's your favorite era? I grew up, my sort of imprint on F1 is Senna, Mansell, Prost, those sort of battles from back in the day. But I really also, the very, very recent, 2020, 2021, the Max and Lewis going together, I thought was a pretty iconic time for F1 as well. Where do you land on that? Where's your most iconic era?
My problem is I don't really have one because I pretty much like Formula One all the way. I go back, I paid attention to the history of Formula One, go back to, the first technical Formula One season, which was 1950, and Giuseppe Farina winning that first championship, Juan Manuel Fangio coming along and winning the first of his 5 championships in 1951, then the first, Ferrari championships in 52 and 53. And I mean, that early era where, you got to realize, Juan Manuel Fangio didn't even win his first championship until he was 40 years old. 40 years old.
Oh, wow.
I mean, think about that in today's numbers, and that 1950s era where, these guys were braver than brave.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great book called The Limit, talking about the 1961 Formula One championship. that was the battle between Wolfgang von Trips and Phil Hill. And I mean, the reason those two guys were in the Ferraris was not because, Enzo Ferrari wanted them. They were the last two guys standing. All the other drivers had been killed. Your odds of surviving Formula One in those days were 1 in 3. 1 in 3. I mean, to be that amazing in terms of being able to drive and survive. And then you get into the 60s when the technology the speed began to improve dramatically. I mean, the rear engines came in at the end of the 1950s. You go into the 60s. And I mean, those cars, you go watch the movie Grand Prix. I mean, they're fast, they're dangerous,
Love that movie.
They're scary. And I mean, it's amazing people survived. And then you get into the 70s and the technology begins to change. Ground effects begins to come in. Then you get the turbo era. I mean, each one of these eras, and each one of these eras has its stars. You go back to, Jackie Stewart, who won 69, 71, 73. You get Fittipaldi. Then you get guys like Mario Andretti or even Jochen Rindt. And then you get into the 80s and you've got, Alain Prost and Nelson Piquet. And the 90s, you've got Ayrton Senna. I mean, there's literally not an era that I don't love, because each one of these eras has something special.
It's true. The different sounds of the engines, the looks of the car. I remember the Tyrrell 6-wheel, which I thought was the coolest thing ever. It was the greatest car in the world, but it
wasn't a bad car, actually. It just needed a little more money and time.
Yeah. But
more importantly, it got outlawed.
Yeah. But what a brilliant interpretation of the rules. Like, I just thought that was the coolest thing at the time.
Well, go back to the Brabham sucker car, right?
The one with the fan.
They had the fans and they were sucking it down. They're like, oh, we got to stop that. And because technology, the bad part about technology, as much as we love it, it just drives up the cost. And what you end up with is truly the haves and the have-nots. You have somebody at the front of the field who has this amazing ability. You get a Red Bull or a Mercedes. They have more money than God. They can do whatever they want. And, and it's easy to say, oh, we're going to limit the amount of money that's spent. That's a bunch of baloney. You buy the best engineers, and the best engineer at 2:00 in the morning on Thursday comes up with this idea when he wakes up in the middle of the night, writes it down, calls his buddy. No one's on the clock at that moment, right? It's not costing him any more money. The only thing it cost was you hired the best people, so
it's a good way of putting it.
The idea that oh, my engineer, this amazing engineer I hired is going to shut off his brain at 5:00. That was the amazing thing about Michael Schumacher. Michael Schumacher would call up Ross Brawn at 11:00 on Tuesday and say, hey, I got an idea. Why don't we try this? And the two of them just worked together so well that they would, they'd get out to Fiorano, the test track, and just see what they could do. And the amazing story about those days is Michael Schumacher would be out there at 7:30 in the morning, pulling the car off the trailer, getting out on, Fiorano is the test track that's right across the street from the Ferrari factory. And they would be doing their testing there. And then his teammate, back then, Eddie Irvine, would show up at 9:30, 10:00 in the morning, because he was kind of a playboy. Now, Eddie Irvine could instantly be within 0.3, half a second of Michael Schumacher, but he could never get that last little bit because he just wasn't as devoted. So I go back to the point, how do you bridge the haves, the have-nots? I mean, there's nothing more that I would love than to see Logan Sargent and Williams have some weird thing that happens that allows them to move up. Remember the year that Jenson Button won the world championship with Braun Racing?
BAR, they finished basically last the year before, and then they turn up. Ross Brawn's figured that double diffuser out, and Brawn is 2 seconds a lap faster off that. They didn't have any sponsors. They were a plain white car. Even Richard Branson was, quick, throw Virgin on the side.
I mean, it was, but the idea that a little team could find that weird little thing that put them into the mix, well, it was great. It was wonderful. And more,
do you think that can happen again?
An exciting year.
Do you think that kind of thing can happen again? Do you just
not.
let the sport do you just let the sport go in the direction that it's supposed to go? Do you let Red Bull run away with it because that's just because they're geniuses and that's just the way they figured it out? Or do you try and rein things in and manufacture more close, intense, fan favorite style of racing because people are into it?
This is not a technical show. This is entertainment. The first thing you have to understand is this is entertainment. And if the fans aren't entertained, then eventually they're going to go away. It doesn't matter. I mean, I remember the era when the engines were turning 19,000 RPM, 19,000. You couldn't see it. You didn't know it, Who cared? What you cared about was that Prost and Senna were ramming into each other in the last corner. That's what mattered. If you don't have entertainment, if you don't have passing on the track, I was just looking at the stats for, I think, last year's Australian Grand Prix. There were 27 on-track passes. 27. I think the St. Pete IndyCar opener had 27 on the first lap. You want people passing each other, and I know it's heresy to say that but like, look at baseball. All these purists in baseball are all upset because this year, now you got a pitch clock, can't have a shift. Yeah. It's like, but you know what? And there was an actual quote from a baseball player, major league player in the New York Times this morning saying, hey, people think we're here to win games. We're not. We're here to entertain. And these days, if you can't entertain, I got news for you. There's 180 other ways that people can go get that entertainment. Video games, other TV shows, other sports. If you're not entertaining, and and I know Nick is a purist. He likes the pure car. My son's the same way. He thinks technical is great. Technical's baloney. If you're not entertaining, if you don't have Max and Hamilton doing this, trying to run each other off the track, why was 2 years ago so awesome? Because you had these two insane people running into each other, doing anything to win the race. That's what I want to see.
They both got on they all got on the thread and they were like, oh, it shouldn't have happened. This is breaking the rules, And I said, yeah, I understand, but wasn't that one of the most iconic ends to a season you've ever seen in your life?
You're going to be talking about it for decades.
I say, because otherwise, I understand if you'd followed the rules, we end under the safety car and Lewis Hamilton is 8-time world champion. But at the same time, like you said, it's two guys, last lap, whoever wins the whole thing. Yeah, no one will ever forget that one.
So one year, I'm at Phoenix International Raceway. I'm standing there with Tom Sneva. Tom Sneva, one of the greatest American race car drivers. Won the Indy 500. We used to call him the gas man at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The first guy to complete a lap at 200 miles an hour, average 200 miles an hour. And Sneva was a big believer in the safety of racing, especially back then. But he was also a big fan of entertainment. So we're standing there watching what was called Formula Mazda back in those days. Then later became Star Mazda. And they're finishing their race, and there are two guys duking it out, trying to see who's going to win. And there's a back marker. They have to come up and slingshot around them, and all three cars are boom, boom, boom across the finish line. You don't know who's won the race. It's so close. People are standing, there's not a lot of people, but they're standing up, they're screaming. It's all exciting. Sneva turns to me and he says, nobody knows those guys are going 45 miles an hour. They don't care. They don't care that those engines are all the same engine. All they cared about was that, guess what? All three went across the finish line. They didn't even know the third one was a back marker. Wasn't even on the same lap. Right? You want excitement. You want entertainment. You don't want to know who's going to win the race. I'm sorry. I know, Nick and I have this argument all the time. He's a purist. I'm not. I'm all about entertainment. How can you make it more entertainment? Think about how much more exciting is when, Max has a 15-point, problem or 15 grid problem because his engine goes out, or Leclerc has to start from the back, or anybody has to start from the back. We love those days, right?
I do like
the racing in the rain.
I do like pure Formula One, Rick. You are right. But I love Max and Red Bull, and I think their domination is incredible. Love it. But
It's great for a year.
Yeah, I'm afraid. Yeah, I don't want to see this newfound interest in F1 wane because there's Tom Brady at the front of the field slinging touchdowns every lap. That I agree with you that we do need some entertainment.
It's a very confusing metaphor, but I followed you on that one. Well, I'll tell you what, Rick, this is my question then, is, if you're talking from purely entertainment, if you were the FIA, if you were Liberty Media, what would you do to make F1 more entertaining?
What they did last year was a step in the right direction. First off, it primarily comes down to tires and aero disturbance in the back of the car. The more you equalize the tires, and more importantly, with three types of tires, the more you make each tire more distinctive. Make a soft tire that is amazingly, ungodly fast for 5 laps and then completely drops off. So somebody at the end of the race will go, you know what? I'm going to come in, I'm going to make this pit stop because I'm going to gain 3 or 4 seconds a lap. Make that so there's a bigger distinction between those tires. take off the tire warmers. It's just an expense. Have the guy squealing as he comes out, all that kind of thing. And then once again, that aero disturbance in the back of the car. And I will give them credit. Last year, they made a huge step in the right direction, as much as they can control the aero disturbance. And then frankly, they need to penalize fast drivers. I mean, that's what they have to do. At some point, they have to say, not fast drivers, but fast teams, and say, you know what, we're going to have to do something to equalize all this out. And we're going to have to either, give other people, it kind of goes back to a few years ago when, what was the team? Was it Force India when, they got the Mercedes side pods? It was like, oh, it's just the new Mercedes.
The pink Mercedes.
Yeah. It's like, so what? Who cares? It kind of comes back to is like, if one team does something, any team should be allowed to do it. You should be able to figure that out. And granted, there's all the complications right now with side pods and Mercedes trying to figure it out. It's still not as simple.
Yeah, because they don't have any. They've just got this skinny little car. They go, oh, maybe we will put side pods on now. Apparently, it makes your car quick. My bad.
Invert the grid. Invert the qualifying grid.
I've always been a big fan of this concept of saying, okay, here's what we ought to do. So let's say that a driver qualifies, up front on the pole, first 3 positions, first 4 positions, whatever. If they're willing to start from dead last, they should be allowed an extra 5 points if they win the race. Think about how that would add things, right? So you're Checo, right? You're not going to beat Max just on pure speed that day, but you qualify second. I'll move to the back of the pack. If Max has a problem, I can gain an extra. So you begin to play this game of you're willing to move to the back and run. Because let's face it, that's exciting to watch Max pour through the pack or anybody. What could you do to change things up? I mean, if you always think the way we've always thought, it's a purist sport. They should be able to, build whatever they want, do it the way they want. And then eventually you end up with, a poor product. And the thing you have to remember, if you go back through the history of racing, the reality is 40, 50 years ago, the races were actually kind of boring. For the most part, you would win a race by, 30 seconds.
A lap.
At the Indy 500, they used to finish, if they had 1 or 2 or 3 cars in the lead lap, it was amazing. And then now over the last, 10, 15 years, we've had these situations where we've got 2 cars, 3 cars duking it out in the last lap, 10 cars on the lead lap. It's amazing what they've got. And I mean, I got to tell you, some people argue, oh, it's just artificial drafting. It's exciting to watch the Indy 500 and watch car after car draft for the lead, or to watch, Takuma Sato trying to pass Dario Franchitti on the last lap and spin out and hit the wall because he was going for it.
Well, he's always been good at hitting the wall. Rick,
hey, the guy's won the Indy 500 twice.
He has. I know. Sato is a legend. Here's my one. All right. Seeing as you're Mr. Entertainment when it comes to F1, what do you think about this one? Is that all tracks have sprinkler systems. And the viewing public, much like they can vote for their favorite driver, they can all vote to make it a wet race. And it can happen all of a sudden, the sprinklers come out and it throws the entire race up in the air. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, it's a nice out of the box thinking. I'll give you that much. I'm not quite sure I'm quite ready to go to that level. But having said that, it would be fun and entertaining, especially because what you do is you water the tracks for, 5 laps, then people would throw everything into chaos. I love rain races. All chaos strikes.
Yes.
People have a hard time staying on the track, and you never know who's going to be able to. Most of the unique race wins have come on rainy situations.
A wet race, you get those amazing winners. What was it? Hang on a second.
Just give them NAS.
Well, that's it. Because Formula E, didn't they do this for a while? That during the races, the fans could vote for their favorite driver, and it would unlock a turbo boost.
Right.
That, so your guy's falling behind, everyone starts voting for him, suddenly unlocks a few more horsepower, but without the horses, and boom, they're off to the races. Something like that in F1, that could be interesting as well.
No, then you start getting into some real gray areas. These guys are, at the end of the day, athletes, and they train and they work really hard to be what they are and put their lives on the line. And now all of a sudden you're going to have Gary in the stands going, oh, give him
so let's go back to your analogy, right? These are amazing athletes. Well, how is it fair that one amazing athlete should have a car that is so much better than another athlete that may be even more amazing? It's not a level playing field.
No,
do whatever you can to level the playing field so that amazing drivers with amazing skills who are stuck in the back. Romain Grosjean, right? I mean, here's a guy who
Right.
comes over to America and he's doing great. He was,
Yeah.
he was a turd in a Haas, right? Because he couldn't do that well. You get Alexander Rossi, when he was driving over, in Formula One with a mediocre team, he comes over here and he's got potential. What you can't see is Logan Sargent. Maybe he's better than we know. He's just in a Williams. I always think, what we really need to do is have a lottery system. Okay, this week you're in the Red Bull, you're in the Mercedes.
You're not wrong. It's the same way that when George was racing at Williams and then he had to sort of super sub in the Mercedes, and he was basically going to win the race until they ended up putting Bottas's tires on his car. That was a tragic one. That one hurt. But I mean, the thing is though, the more you try and make it an even playing field, aren't we now heading towards just IndyCar and NASCAR? We've got to have something.
Whoa. You're saying IndyCar and NASCAR are bad?
No,
look at the number of on-track passes on IndyCar in any race. Any race will almost, there was a year when St. Pete had almost as many on-track passes as Formula One had in the entire season. The entire season, just a few years ago.
I remember back before DRS, you maybe get 2 overtakes on a lap. I thought DRS for me is one of the best inventions I think Formula One came up with, because suddenly you were having so many maneuvers.
And let's go back to the purists. The purists are going to say, well, wait a minute, we're altering the game, right? What DRS? We're allowing some people in the back. I was like, come on. At some point, you have to think, what is entertaining? It's all about entertainment. And once again, I don't want to know who's going to qualify in the poll. Let's take a quick poll. A survey of the three of us. Who's going to be on pole in Australia?
Max
Max.
Verstappen.
Okay. Why are we going to watch the race? Who's going to win the race likely in Australia?
Yep,
Max Verstappen.
Okay, why are we going to watch the race? What can we do to change that? Right now, we're going, okay, here's the real excitement. Where's
but we had the same kind of thing when it was Michael Schumacher, and we had the same kind of thing for 7 years with Hamilton, and we all still love Formula One.
No, we didn't. We hated it. We had to do a tease one time for, we're right in the middle of one of the Schumacher's great runs. He's winning, God only knows how many races, in the middle of winning championships. And we're trying to think of, how do we tease the race? Ooh, are you excited? Who's going to win? We can't say that. What we came up with? Dan Schutte, who was the producer back then, came up with this brilliant idea for one race. And it was really good, because he said, you're going to tell your children that you watched Michael Schumacher. And it's true. You watched a generational talent just wipe out the competition. Well, that's good for one race. After that, we're like, okay, now what do we say? It's the same thing when Hamilton was at his peak, no offense, people weren't paying attention to Formula One races.
It is kind of true, because I fell off a little bit. Ollie was kind of pulled me back into F1.
And I like Hamilton.
Yeah.
I think he's an interesting guy. He's a great championship, but come on. And the problem is, it wasn't just that Hamilton was that good. It was that Mercedes was that good. Yeah. And so it's unfair to all the other drivers, because they don't get some of whatever it is that Mercedes had, that special magical juice.
Yeah. And let's bring that up, because, Lewis has been quoted as saying, I don't think we've ever seen a car this fast. And of course, Formula Dank brought the receipts of, going back to 2016 or something like that, 3 laps after a safety car's been released, the Mercedes are a whole lap ahead of every other car on track. So we have seen situations like this. I think what we're rooting for, the one that we've been talking about, right, is that everyone's now rooting for Checo and Alonso. Yeah. And that's it. It's like, that's what
always root for the back markers. Yeah. I've spent my entire, you were asked who's my favorite driver. My favorite driver is whoever is in last place and is moving up. If you can move up 10 positions, you're my favorite driver. If you can start third and win the race, you're my favorite driver. It doesn't really matter to me. I don't have a favorite driver at any given track on any given day. I like Max for certain reasons. I like Checo for certain reasons. I like Hamilton for certain reasons. What I want to see is somebody come out of the middle of the pack and have an amazing day. And the problem is right now, that can't happen.
Ooh, we shall see that. I tell you what, Rick, honestly, I think we could talk to you for hours. Maybe we'll have you back on the show when we've had a race as well. It'd be great to get your perspective on something like that. But honestly, at this point, we probably should wrap up the episode. But yeah, I want to talk more about this. It really was a fascinating chat, because I love your approach. I love that you just look for the entertainment, and I love that that's going to be very much against what Nick and I sort of want to tell ourselves that we think Formula One should be.
Rick, thanks, man. Great having you here. I really appreciate everything that you've brought to the show today. Thank you very much. RickDeBruhl.com if anybody needs to get in touch with you.
That's the easiest way.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Awesome.